started with some intro since it's 5 after here. Give me a second here. So I think most of us know Dr. Tony Tarchichi, but I will introduce him and thank him for giving us this presentation today. So Tony is an associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine in the Paul C. Gaffney Division of Pediatric Hospital Medicine. And he is the creator and host of the PHM from Pittsburgh Continuing Medical Education podcast. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree from Temple University and completed medical school at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, where he also completed a combined medicine pediatrics residency. He was the chief resident in the MedPeds program and was the pediatric chief resident the following year. He's published numerous articles in using podcasting as a source of continuing medical education, which he will be speaking about with us today. And his research interests include how newer media affects learning patterns of physicians. He currently serves on the Executive Council for the American Academy of Pediatrics section on hospital medicine and is the current Pediatric Hospital Medicine Fellowship Director at UPMC Children's. And with no further ado, Tony, thank you so much for teaching us today about podcasting and medical education.
Noelle, thank you very much. I really appreciate that introduction. Thank you. And it's just like anytime you give a lecture, I just heard a lot of banging outside of my door, so I don't know what that was. But as you all heard, we have the PHM from Pittsburgh podcast. We're going to be talking about podcasting, medical education in general. I'm going to dive right in. So before we start, that should have moved. That's not good. Okay, before we start, disclosures. Now, normally this is where I would make the corny joke. At this point, it's an old joke. I don't have any disclosures. I can't wait till I do. Whenever you make that joke, this is not what you mean by that for this particular disclosure. So this is a little bit of a story. We got my kids the Green Light app, which allows them to save and to donate and then also to invest. And my oldest son wanted to invest, and so he saved his Christmas and birthday money. And the only company he really knows is Apple, because he has an iPad, we have Macs, my wife has an iPhone. So he bought 2 shares of Apple, which he still has, and it's not doing great, but it's okay. But we own he owns, but we own, because we're his parents, 2 shares of Apple. And I will be talking about Mac computers and how they're a little bit better for podcasting because of the microphone. So you should know there's a conflict of interest. Otherwise, I have no other conflict of interest. So that was long. What we're going to learn about today, this is the order of operations. We're going to do learning styles, popularity of podcast usage in medical education by learners, knowledge retention via podcast and learners, qualitative review, formatting of podcasting, and we're going to use evidence-based literature to guide all of this. And then a very brief how-to guide if we have time. Noelle, I'm going to ask you to keep me on track for a time. I'll keep looking at it, but let me know if I'm going too long, please. And if anyone has questions, I won't be able to see anything. So your first question may be, why are we discussing learning styles first? That's not a part of podcasting. If you've done this for a while at all, whenever you talk about a podcast or a podcast you have or podcasting in general, you're invariably going to hear somebody say, I'm not an auditory learner. I can't learn that way. So it doesn't work for me. And I hear that a lot, and people would say that to me, and I would honestly thought it struck me as odd. I didn't know the literature because I felt like at some point somewhere someone must have said something to you that you remembered. So I thought of, is this a real thing? So first, let's define learning styles. Learning styles are a concept that individuals differ in regards to what mode of instruction or study is most effective for them, right? If you're a visual learner, that should be how you learn best. But the question I had was, is this really a thing? Are learning styles a thing? And when you start with the medical education literature on learning styles, you invariably get to these models. You get to the VARC model popularized by Fleming and Mills in 1992, and of course the Myers-Briggs assessment. And there's still lots of papers being published in the medical education literature where they do polls of medical student classes, and then when you do the VARC model, it really categorizes you into whether you're 70% visual and 20% auditory and then reading or kinesthetic. And it's very popular, these learning styles. In fact, there's whole companies that are built off of having teachers pay so they can learn their learning styles and then help them learn their learners' learning styles. And the goal of that is if the teacher knows her learning style or his learning style, and they know their learner's learning style, then they should be able to teach them better. That's the kind of overall assumption about this. And Fleming and Mills, the VARC model, was really fun because it went off of inventories. Inventories was the way this used to be done, where you'd ask questions and people would put themselves basically in categories by answering the questions. The problem with that is people even back then and now hate being put in a category. So they would make stuff up and put different answers in because they just hated them. And so Fleming and Mills figured out a different way to do it, where they would ask different questions, like if you were going to give somebody directions to go to a place they've never been, how would you do it? Would you write it down? Would you just tell them? Would you guide them there yourself? And then the flip side of that, if you wanted directions for a place you've never been, how would you do it? And so that was interesting. And of course, the Myers-Briggs assessment. But when you begin to look at learning styles, the home for that particular learning or method is not in medical education. The home for it is cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And when you look at the cognitive psychology and neuroscience literature, first of all, it's thousands of papers. This goes back to the 30s. Second of all, they look at learning styles like they're a myth. In fact, they treat them like Bigfoot or like the Loch Ness Monster. They really believe they're myths. And this was because of some very well done studies by Massa and Meyer in 2006, where they figured out people's learning styles based on these tests, and then they gave them computerized, randomized controlled trial assessments where they had them take these tests, and if they were visual learners, they give them visual cues. Then they'd had to take another different similar test, but auditory cues. And they actually found that the idea that different instructional methods should be used for visual learners or verbal learners is false. They found no assistance whatsoever. And this was important because even now, when you take the Myers-Briggs, you hear it's a validated study, and the VARC model is a validated study. And we all want validated studies and validated tests and validated lunches and validated everything. But what does validated actually mean? A validated study actually just means every time you take that test, whether it's today, tomorrow, next week, next month, you're going to get a similar answer. It doesn't mean the answer means anything or is any good. It just means the answer is going to be standardized. It'll be similar every time you take it. If I take this test now and then 3 months from now, I'm going to get similar answers. In addition to Massa and Meyer, there was Cook, Thompson, and Thompson, which did a study in 2009 on internal medicine residents, 123 of them, and they found no support for learning styles whatsoever. So again, the question we ask ourselves is, learning styles, is it a thing? And honestly, the answer is no. It's really viewed as a myth in the cognitive psychology and neuroscience literature and in general, that you cannot learn if you're I want to be very specific about this. If you take a Myers-Briggs and you're a visual learner, it doesn't mean you're going to learn better with visual cues as opposed to auditory cues. This is important for us because if we're going to examine podcasting, we have to deal with this notion that people can only learn certain ways or they learn better in certain ways. It may be true. We haven't proven it yet, and none of our validated assessments are good for it. So once we put that aside, the question we ask ourselves is, do learners actually use podcasts for their own education in healthcare? Right? Why am I here? Like, are we just here because Noel had nobody else to ask and I just said, sure, I'll say something? Or is this something people actually use? So let's start with that question. This was a study done in anesthesiology. This was in 10 Canadian anesthesia residencies, and 151 Canadian anesthesia residents were surveyed. This is way back in 2010, 2011, really not long after podcasting started becoming popular. The anesthesia residents took this survey. It was voluntary. They were asked questions about their medical education podcast uses, and it was done via Qualtrics. What they found at that time was about 60% of them in the study reported using medical education podcasts. 67% of the users reported using it up to 1 hour per week. And this is why I included it. This last point I love. Of those who did not use it, 97% gave the reason that they didn't know it was available or they would have used it. And this is back in 2010, 2011. Now, if you want to talk about podcasting in medical education, the group that has really made it popular and done the scholarship to push the field is emergency medicine by far. So this was a study done, it's actually a pretty famous study at this point. It was sent to emergency medicine residents in the US from June to December of 2012. It was an 8-question voluntary survey asking respondents about their demographics, their use of extracurricular time, and the materials they perceived as most beneficial. 401 residents received the survey, 226 completed it, which is pretty good. Here's what they found. 97.7% reported spending at least 1 hour per week engaging in extracurricular education. That's great. That's what you want in a resident, right? 34.5%, 2 to 4 hours per week, which was significant. Time listening to podcasts was the most popular, reported by 35% of the residents, followed by reading textbooks and Google. I mean, podcasts beat Google, which I find wonderful. Residents endorse podcasts as the most beneficial compared to textbooks, compared to journals, and compared to Google. And this was not that long ago. Residents really find podcasts to be the most beneficial thing. Now, we've talked about residents, and this is the same in medical students. What about attendings? We care about how attendings learn too. And remember, this started back in 2010, 2017. All these residents are now attending. So are they still doing this? This was a study published for the field of pediatrics by me and Dr. Smuziak, my research partner. And we used a convenience sample to assess attitudes about podcasting as a source of medical education. We surveyed listeners of the PHM from Pittsburgh podcast in 2018, again, using Qualtrics. And we were the first study to look at, that I know of, primarily attending physicians' attitudes about podcasting for medical education. We had 129 respondents. Now we don't have an N because I have no idea how many people listen to the podcast in total. It ranges depending upon the episode. And 75% of them were attendings. 57.4% worked in an academic hospital, and about 35% worked in a community hospital. And we liked the variation. So here's what they said. When I asked about podcasts, they found 98.4% of them found that our podcast was of high educational value. 97.7% of respondents found it to be the same, better, or much better than a medical journal. And the examples we gave were New England Journal of Medicine, Pediatrics in Review, because we wanted to aim high. 95.3%, these are high numbers, felt the podcast was the same, better, or much better than grand rounds at an academic center. And 86% felt that the podcast was the same, better, or much better than a regional or national medical conference. I didn't expect these results, but we published these results because it was, to me, a little bit remarkable. So many felt it was as good, if not better, than all of these things that we use. And if you're asking yourself, do all fields have published studies on the popularity of podcasts with their learners? Yes. These are all the fields, and there's more. I just couldn't make a bigger slide. So all of these fields have published studies that their learners use podcasts for medical education, even dermatology. And honestly, that surprised me because, dermatology is a field where you have to look at stuff. So that was surprising. So we're going to do our first poll question, if I can do this correctly. Since we've talked about how popular podcasting is for medical education, can you all see your poll?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah. So the question before us is, do you use medical education podcasts for your own education? Can you see results too, or no?
Yeah.
Oh, good. All right. So 5 of 6 of you answered already. That was wonderful. Oh, all 6, great. So 4 out of 6 say yes and 2 say no. So 6-7%, that's pretty good. So I'm going to end the poll now since everybody's participated. Thank you for participating.
Oh, wait. Hey, Tony, I'm sorry. I lied. I don't see the poll results.
Oh, I'm going to share results.
Oh, there it is.
You see it?
Yep, now I see it.
All right. All right, so now we're going to stop sharing. So this is just our little group. It's fascinating, right? So now we're going to stop sharing. And I'm going to close this. And you should be seeing, do you see how and why do learners use podcasts for their own education?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, we're back on track. So now we know that they do use podcasts. The next question we got to ask is how and why do they use podcasts? What's the reason? And for that, we're going to look at a qualitative study. Now, forgive me, this is too remedial for you, but just to quickly review qualitative versus quantitative. Quantitative studies review numerical information, something like how far you can kick a ball, or Likert scale surveys. Those are quantitative studies. Qualitative studies, very briefly, are more in-depth. You get richer data, but you got to spend more time with them. You're really looking for more of an open-ended question and a lot of responses from people. They're very difficult to set up, but they give you a lot of information. This was by far the best qualitative study on podcasting in medical education. It's published in Academic Medicine 2 years ago. So this group did hour-long one-on-one semi-structured interviews with participants in person or on video conference from March 2016 to August 2017. Again, emergency medicine is where a lot of the literature is. They're doing great work in it, and they have a lot of podcasts. So there were 16 EM residents participating in the study, 5 female, 11 male. They range from PGY1 to PGY5. All the participants used podcasts for their education. So we wanted to know why. What we found was there was 3 broad interconnected themes. Opportunistic engagement. This makes sense, right? Podcasts are easy to use. They're entertaining. You can listen while you're doing other activities, but they did acknowledge the drawbacks. Let's talk about that a little bit. The mental energy in the study they talked about, that the respondents talked about, the mental energy listening to a podcast is much less than traditional learning. It's a more relaxing way of studying. It feels like it demands less of them. That was a direct quote. They're more engaging compared with other formats because they like the humor, the jokes. I mean, on our podcast, we used to do a corny joke segment, and people loved that. And they liked the music. Residents also felt that they were being more efficient. Instead of just doing their laundry or doing their dishes, they threw a podcast on, they did their laundry, they did their dishes, they worked out, and they enjoyed it. The drawbacks, they did recognize that easy listening didn't always translate into deep learning, that sometimes they could easily zone out and not remember. And less demand usually meant things are less effective. That was a direct quote from them as well. And if the episode was boring, heaven forbid, we're never boring, they would stop listening altogether. So that was one of the points. The other point of the 3 was community. And this was interesting to me because it wasn't just community broadly, which it was, but a local community. They talked about the podcast almost like a book club with their co-residents, right? So if PGY1 had a patient with a diagnosis they didn't know, their senior would say, hey, listen to this in this podcast. They had this episode on this. It'll help you understand it. It was almost like a secret curriculum amongst the residents that they really, really liked. And they also liked the idea that it could help them when they say speak the same language. What they mean is they could talk with their attendings at an attending level using that dialogue earlier than they normally would, because the podcast gave them the lingo and helped give them the understanding. And they felt they could ask smarter questions. They felt like insiders. And then this feeling of fellowship to the host. And I have had that happen where they feel like they know the host from listening to them over a period of time, like they're friends. And I've had people, when I've been in line at national conferences and I talk to myself like, oh, should I get the oatmeal? Should I get the yogurt? They stop me and say, I know your voice. I love your podcast. And they're almost happy to see an old friend, which is really nice. But the negative side of this was, if you listen to the podcast, you're well connected. If you don't listen to the podcast, maybe you're a Luddite, which they used, and I didn't know what that meant. And Luddite is a person opposed to new technology or ways of working. There can be tensions that arise if you listen to a podcast and has a certain way of treating the diagnosis and you have a different way of treating it. And then groupthink, the echo chamber, meaning everyone begins to say the same things the host said because they all got their information from the same place. And that would terrify my group, everyone talking like me in our residency, but we're going to put that aside. The third thing is personalized learning. And this quote I felt really said it all, because it talks, I'll read it out loud. I want to be learning all the time during residency. I feel both internal and external pressure to learn and study continuously. Often that's hard because there's a pressure to study that combines with kind of just needing to live your life. You don't have that much free time when you're in residency. Podcasts give an opportunity to incorporate more learning time, more learning rich time in my day-to-day life without necessarily having to dedicate that time solely, specifically to studying. They felt this academic insecurity. A lot of them use that word, that they need to be learning all the time. And if they stop, they're not doing right by their patients. So they like the idea of transforming their idle time to study time. And also they like the idea of being able to pick. So if you didn't understand why the hypernatremia was an issue, you'd listen to the PHM from Pittsburgh episode with Mike Moritz talking about sodium, right? So you could really pick and choose what you most need help in. So do attendings feel the same? Remember, that was a qualitative study purely with residents. Do attendings feel the same? In the study John and I did, we asked open-ended questions and certain themes arose from that, which you're going to find extremely similar, right? There was a convenience. They could do it on their own time. Format for multitasking, exactly the same. The most humorous comment I got was somebody said, it's not as good as 80s rock, but it helps me when I'm on the treadmill, which I found wonderful. Clinically relevant and applicable. We have a podcast for hospitalists and their hospitalists are listening. So it's directly related to what they're doing and connection to a broader hospitalist community. The best comment I got from this one was, I am a pediatric hospitalist trapped in a sea of adult doctors, and it keeps me connected to the broader hospitalist community, which was just a great comment. So now that we know how and why they listen, and if they listen, we have to ask ourselves if they're actually learning when they listen, because that's one of the goals of this, right? That they learn what we want them to learn. To do that, we have to talk about Kirkpatrick's model. Kirkpatrick's model is a model used to evaluate the impact of intervention in education. Now, I'm going to take 1 second and just make a, what's it called, a PR statement. When I was writing this paper, I do not have a master's in medical education. So John and I wrote a paper. It went to academic medicine. They rejected it outright within 3 minutes. It's very terrible. But we sent it to another journal. I think it was Journal of Continuing Health Education. And the reviewer sent us back a beautifully written feedback. And he talked about, he or she, I don't know who it was, talked about ways to make it better, gave us references on things to read to help, and really took a lot of time. And I have to tell you, it was immensely helpful, because this was one of the things they talked about. And then at that point, I read about it. John, of course, knew about it. And it helped a lot. So if you're a reviewer for a journal and you take that time, recognize people really appreciate it. We wrote back to the journal and really I thought was a very well-worded and heartfelt thank you to that reviewer, because they took a lot of time to do it and we really appreciated it. So now back to this, Kirkpatrick's model. This is very straightforward. When you want to evaluate the impact of a new intervention in education, the first level is, what did the participants think of the program, right? This is all the questionnaires we get whenever we go to national conferences or anything. Did you like it? Was it great? Was there advertising? The next level is the change in knowledge, skills, or attitude with respect to the training objectives. Did they learn what you wanted them to learn, right? That's very straightforward. It's usually a pre-test and a post-test. Level 3 is changes in job behaviors. If you're doing a podcast on prescribing PPIs for reflux, to give a simple example, you could then do a chart review of the people beforehand and afterwards to see if they prescribe more PPIs with reflux. The job behavior changed. That's level 3. Level 4 is bottom line, the bottom line contribution. So for us, it's patient effect. So if they're prescribing more PPIs, is it actually making patients less symptomatic? And are patients taking the PPIs? That's your bottom line. We have been really focused on level 1 up until now, reaction. We're going to move into level 2, learning. Are people learning with podcasts? Are they learning better or the same as traditional methods? That's the question we're asking. So first, before we start, I love the title of this slide. I just do. Podcast versus the written word in orthopedics. I really love it. So this was a study done in Germany on German medical school in November 2012 to 2013, February 2013. The aim of the study was to analyze student satisfaction and gain of knowledge when learning about the same orthopedic diseases using either podcast or textbook chapters in a control randomized setting. So these students were 2/3 of the way through their medical school training. None of them had learned this material, and it was a voluntary participation. So internet interest and sign up was elicited via email. They were told they would not be graded. Interestingly, they weren't given any money. Typically within the US studies, the residents or medical students are given $5 or $20 gift cards. But in Germany, they weren't given anything. So they used textbook chapters versus created podcast for 4 well-known ortho conditions: Achilles tendon rupture, radial head fracture, scoliosis, shoulder dislocation. And what they did was they walked into this room and there was an attitudinal survey and a pretest. They were randomized, and then they were put in either textbook group or podcast group. They were given the intervention. The intervention was 15 to 20 minutes in a computer room with a monitor, a person walking around, preventing them from talking. And then they left the room after they either had the textbook chapter or the podcast, and they did an attitudinal survey and a post test. The pre-test was about 10 to 12 questions. The post-test was 22 to 26 questions. So then what happened? Well, here's kind of, there was 130 students. 60% of the students were female, which we'll come back to for a separate but interesting point. 75 went in the podcast group, 55 went in the textbook group. This slide, and I referenced it here, is one of really the bulk of the results. Significantly more correct answers in the post-test compared to pre-test were achieved in both the podcast group and the text group, but there was no significant difference between the pre-test groups, but significantly higher scores were observed in the post-test for podcast users. The podcast users did better, and not just better in that, they had a higher gain of knowledge compared to textbook users, and their evaluations showed a significantly higher approval of podcasts regarding comprehensibility, teaching efficacy, and fun learning with it. And if you're worried about the distribution of the group, they did use Cronbach's Alpha. Cronbach's Alpha is a measure to use to assess the reliability or internal consistency of a set of scale or test items. Cronbach's Alpha for the podcast group was 0.86, 0.9 and above is the best, so 0.86 is very good. And for the textbook group is 0.81, which is again, very, very good. So the distribution was good. The comment on female medical students. Interestingly, the female students gained significantly more knowledge by the use of textbooks than did the males, but there was no difference in sex on podcast usage. Well, I just found that interesting. All right. This is another throwdown, right? Podcast versus written case series in OBGYN. This took place at Brown University in the US. Obstetrical neurology was the topic. It occurred in 2016, 2017, so like a stone's throw away from us right now. And this was, they hypothesized here that a narrative podcast, now a narrative podcast is a podcast that uses storytelling, would provide similar increase in content-specific knowledge to residents and fellows compared to a written case series, but would be rated superior learning platform on feedback. And a written case series is like Pediatrics in Review and Brief, or the New England Journal of Medicine has a case series. So of that ilk. So this where they created optional in-person conferences. Residents or fellows would volunteer to come. They were paid, I think, $5 with a gift card. And they were taken from the following departments: neuro, OBGYN, family medicine, internal medicine, and EM. 60 residents volunteered. So each conference covered only one illustrative obstetrical neurology topic, like stroke and pregnancy was 4 conferences and cohorts, and migraine and pregnancy was 2 conferences and cohorts. So what did the authors do? They created a narrative style podcast with expert, again, 15 to 20 minutes long. They also created a written clinical case series matching real patient scenarios with lit reviews, 1,000 to 3,000 words. And when these students or the residents came into the conference room, they were randomized out of the podcast or written case series section. They got that content-specific pre-test, and then they got their attitudinal survey. They did their 15 to 20 minutes, same format, in a room, computer room, alone. There was a monitor walking around making sure nobody talked. And then after they left, they took the post-test and attitudinal survey. Results here were that the podcast and written groups performed equally well with increases in post-test scores. They both did about the same. They both did the same. There was no difference, which is good. One is not inferior to another. But on the feedback questionnaire, and this is where the meat of this is, the podcast rated higher than written case series in maintaining interest, enjoyability, entertainment, and wanting to listen to them more often in medical education. They did other ratings like sparking interest as opposed to maintaining interest, providing satisfaction, or using it again in one's field, and they both scored similar, the podcast and the written case series. So that study showed it was equivalent. Now this I don't have a ton of time to go through this study, but I'm going to tell you why I like this so much. This was also done, again, in emergency medicine. This was 6 emergency medicine residencies in the US. This was a prospective, double-blind, randomized controlled trial. It's probably one of the better studies they've done. This was designed to evaluate the effect of interpolated questions on the knowledge acquisition and retention of podcast content. If you don't know what interpolated questions are, it's specifically designed for VHS video. Oh God, VHS. Now I'm dating myself. Video, a webinar series. That's where in the middle or the first third of a series, if you're giving a talk and you know people are listening recorded, you would stop and say something to the effect of, do you remember what the Master and Meyer review that we talked about earlier said and what it showed about learning styles? If you don't, rewind and go back. That type of interpolated question would make the listener stop and go back. And they've been proven to help with knowledge retention, keeping the information you learned specifically about that question for a longer period of time than everything else. So this was a study done to look at that interpolated questions in podcasts. Now, here's why I like this study. To do this study, you have to have the underlying assumption that podcasts are good sources of education. This was one of the first studies done that said we're no longer going to prove if it's good or not. It's good. It's a good source of education. Now let's make it better. And then what they found was podcasts, what they expected to find. Interpolated questions improved knowledge retention at 2 and 3 weeks after the listeners listened. And it was driven by the retention of the material covered by the interpolated questions. So you use them in a way to drive home specific points. That's why I love this study, because it really showed that now in the literature, we've begun to move beyond this type of, are they helpful, who's listening to them and where, to let's make them better because they're really good, I think. All right, poll slide. Let me do the poll question. Number 2, here we go. Can you all see the question?
Yes.
Okay. Please pick your favorite medical education podcast. I may have put a couple of ringers to help me win this, but I'm the host, I'm allowed. All right, we got 3 people. Okay, good. 4, 5. Okay, good. I'm doing all right. If you don't know what Pardon the Interruption is a ESPN show. It's my favorite show on television. We have about 7 people in. If it's okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. You all should be seeing the results now. Looks like PHM from Pittsburgh won. Oh, PTI is not okay. I don't blame you for PTI. It's great. PediaCast is Mike Patrick out in Nationwide. I know him well. He's a very nice guy. He'll be happy to know he got one. All right, we're going to stop sharing. I'm going to get rid of that. That was fun. So now the question before us, we've moved past, do people learn? They learn. We've moved past, are they popular? They are. And what do they use them for? So what makes a medical education podcast good? But what we mean by that is, are there any quality indicators for medical education podcasts? And of course there are, right? Why would I ask the question? So this is by far the most popular and most cited study in all of this field, if you can call it a field. It was by Michelle Lin et al. And this is cited in everything ever written about podcasts. This was done at the 2014 International Conference on Residency Education. It was at a pre-conference social media summit. The group who did it was self-selected group of health educators who were attending. They did a modified Delphi study. Now, if you don't know what a Delphi study is, have no fear. This is what a Delphi study is. It's a research design that usually involves 3 rounds of surveys that are distributed to a panel of experts, with each round being informed by the responses to the previous round. Now, why this was modified is they only did it 2 rounds, and it was 2 real-time sequential web-based surveys completed during a 2-hour session. So here's what happened. And I pulled this right from the paper, so here's my reference. 44 of these experts, self-selected, participated. They did QI, they did blogs and podcasts. And these 151 quality indicators from podcasting came from, you guessed it, an emergency medicine paper done that found those 151 quality indicators. And the goal was to wean that number down. That's just too many. So the first survey, they just split the people up randomly into 2 groups and gave them half of the blogs and half of the podcast. And they put Likert scale surveys, 1 to 7, 1 being the worst, 7 being the best. And any of the quality indicators with a score of 5 or more out of 7 would then move on to round 2. And in round 2, they have the quality indicators here that made it through. They would give a yes or no response. And the question was, would you want this included in the final set? That was really the question, yes or no. And any specific quality indicator with more than 90% yes responses made it through. And of that, there were 13 that were chosen. So here they are. First, the quality indicator is authors cite their conflict of interest, which we do. Clear identity of the podcast author. And I put podcast to make it easier for us to read through this. Clear distinction between fact and opinion, accurate information presented, use technologies which are universally available with standard equipment and software. You can see these are all pretty straightforward. Podcast cites its references. Podcast statements consistent with references, which makes sense. Podcast clearly differentiates between advertising and content, which is a no-brainer for us because we give free CME through the University of Pittsburgh, and they do not allow us to advertise. Otherwise, we may. Transparent about who was involved in its creation. The content should be of good quality. The content should be professional. So no podcasting for me on my March Madness bracket picks, although that'd be great. Podcast should be useful and relevant for its intended audience. And finally, is the author well qualified to provide information on this topic? For this number 13, I'm going to ask everybody from PHM to stay muted because I do not want heckling, because I expect it, good-natured heckling, but I expect it on number 13. So we're going to move right along, not to give them that opportunity. So now that we've gone through the quality indicators, are there any evidence-based recommendations for the format of a medical education podcast? So this was now this is interesting, right? This was the same qualitative study we talked about earlier, but they just took some of the data to write that one paper and other data to write this paper. So what does this teach us? If you do a good qualitative study, you can publish twice. So this was a secondary analysis of the original study discussed earlier. They did again, I did the hour-long sessions, 16 EM residents. Here's the themes that arose for their perception of effective features of educational podcasts. And again, EM was selected at the time of this study. There was 42 different EM-related podcasts. So it's just a plethora of opportunities. So the themes that arose are similar things we've seen. It has to be clinically relevant, high yield. Now this high yield point emphasis, it was remarkable when they brought it up, how they brought it up. The residents wanted you to beat the high yields as much as you could. Really bring them in there. Mention them again, mention them again. It reminded me of the old commercials for different law firms when you're like sitting at home when you're younger and it's the middle of the day, and how they just say the phone number over and over again and over and over again and over. This is what they want you to do for the high yield points. They want you to drive it in. Multiple voices, not a monologue. We're going to talk about that for a little bit. Efficiency, don't take forever to make key points. Don't drag it out. So they would not like PHM from Pittsburgh. Not boring, jokes, music, etc. Conversational, like storytelling, narrative style. Repetition, again, back to the emphasis on high yield points. They want you to summarize at the end the high yield points you had beaten into them earlier. And then they want you to summarize the summary at the end, which is what a few of them said, which was remarkable. Good technical quality. Now, here is where there's some leeway. The better the technical quality, the more likely they are to listen. But as long as it's not awful, they'll listen if the content is good. And the shorter, the better, which we're going to talk about, 15 to 20 minutes. Styles. There are two main styles that have been discussed in the literature regarding podcasts: dialogue and narrative style. The narrative style is more emphasis on storytelling and listener engagement. There's a description, chronology, characters, cause and effect. This helps us learn from patient experiences for patients we don't see. And this is narrative medicine, right? It has been shown to promote sense-making, empathy, memory, reflection on practice, professional identity, illness script development, and they think it could even entail unique neural networks. Now, this should make sense. NPR uses this style all the time. And where are we here? Oh, sorry. NPR uses this style all the time. And this is really well described in the psychiatry literature. There are podcasts in psychiatry and in palliative care really use this narrative style. They tell you a patient story. If you're talking about depression or bipolar or anorexia, they're going to tell you a patient story, and then you're going to walk through that patient's life, and then they're going to pull you out to have some expert conversation about it and bring you back into their life. The other method is dialogue. Learners prefer dialogue to monologue. They also prefer having a junior learner at their level asking questions to the expert. They find it highly engaging. Numerous qualitative studies talked about this, that they feel like they're eavesdropping on a conversation and it makes them more interested in paying attention when you have a junior learner and a senior learner. And for even attendings like it, because they on our podcast, they like that I'm a hospitalist, and if I talk to an ID specialist or an EM specialist or a nephrologist or whomever, I'm talking to them from what I know, which isn't what they know. So they like the fact that I know what they know, and then the experts will fill us in. That's what people prefer. But there have been no studies comparing these two styles head to head. In fact, they're both used simultaneously on medical education podcasts. And then they're used in popular culture shows, like John Oliver's show did it when he talked about Monica Lewinsky, used the narrative and dialogue style. And it was a very, very well done show, and others have used it. So now, how long should the podcast be? Almost universally, the literature supports podcasts being less than 30 minutes in duration, ideally around 15 to 20 minutes. I put almost in bold and italics to underline for a reason, but the bulk of this literature was from residents and medical students, and these were things they had to do. They signed up for a conference. They were in a class. They were learning something for their program. They have to do this, so they want it short and sweet. On our study, we had different results. Remember, our podcast is for attendings. Nobody has to do anything. You can listen if you choose to. And when we asked our respondents about the length of the podcast episode, and our podcasts are about an hour long, almost universally. Again, we use a convenience sample that can promote bias, so please keep that in mind when you're listening to what we did. Two of them, God bless their souls, thought it was too short. 77.5% thought it was just right. And then about 21% thought it was too long. So what could this mean? To me, this means the motivation of the listener is important. Do they have to listen, or are they choosing to? And I think that differentiates whether or not they will want it short and sweet or a little bit longer. So we're going to do our last poll. Here we go. We're going to launch it. All right, these were made tongue in cheek, so enjoy. People are getting it. Good, 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 good. Take a sip of water while we're doing that. All right, we got about 7 of 10 people participated so far. We're about 30 seconds, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So most people recognize it was a trick question, but I'm glad you guys like the MIC of the heart and the review of the febrile infants. That's really great. All right, now I am going to stop sharing. We're going to plow through. So the next question may be asking, all right, this is all great. How do you create a podcast? Glad you asked that question. You can create a podcast with only your laptop. An example of a podcast that only used a laptop was Peas in a Pod. Peas in a Pod would have students just take out their laptop and they would record and they would send it in and they would adjust it. They would adjust it slightly for the audio, but that's all they had. And this is important why I did the disclosure, because honestly, Macs are the best for this. They have the best built-in microphone. They have the best speaker system and recording ability. I've found them better than PCs. But again, I own 2 shares, so take that as you will. But typically, you're going to need a laptop and a microphone. Any microphone will do. I have slides on that, but we're not going to do that this time because I don't want to run out of time. And the audio editing software is what people always get stuck on. I don't know how to audio edit. I'm going to be very honest with you. I had no idea how to audio edit. I had never done it before. These are the major 2 audio editors that are free that people use. Audacity, which you can download for free, which is what I primarily use, and GarageBand, which comes free in a Mac, which Dr. Velody uses because he does a podcast. I went to YouTube and I put in Audacity for Dummies, And a lovely bunch of YouTube videos showed up with very nice people who had like 100 views on their video, showing you how to use Audacity for everything from bumpers to editing to all of it. And it was very easy. And of course, Dr. Velotti helped me out as well. So I'll give him a shout out. So then the next question you may be asking is, how do you get your podcast on apps and websites? What that is a RSS, a really simple syndication. It's a feed. Now, if you're technically savvy enough, you can go to each specific site you want it on and create an RSS feed, and you can do that. I am not that savvy. I use, and of course, Dr. Velotti uses as well, libsyn.com. It's a website that, and again, I own no shares in it, but I own nothing in it. But you basically, you upload your podcast, the audio, you can put in whatever verbiage to describe it you want. You tell them where you want the podcast to go, YouTube, iPhone, Google Play, all the stuff. And then we'll send it there automatically. And then they'll give you your download numbers and whatever data you want based on how much you pay. And there's other sites beside Libsyn. You're welcome to Google it and find the one you like best. Most people who do this, and in fact, everyone in pediatric medical education podcasting that I know uses Libsyn. So next steps in the podcast literature. We got to deal with the problem of not having quality control, such as peer review, right? Anybody can say anything, which was evident with the Joe Rogan experience. So you have to, there should be some quality control. I don't know what that'll be. And it's something we've begun thinking about. We would love to get Kirkpatrick's level 3 type evidence and or national level 2 evidence. What I mean by that is using podcasts in a way for GME education nationally, which I'm working on now with Dr. Lynn, Dr. Philomena Lynn or Ling from ID, to really show that even for training, it can be beneficial. And then more literature on how to make podcasts even more effective instead of proving their effectiveness. That's where I'd love to see us go. Now, quick acknowledgements. My division has been very supportive of the podcast in terms of paying for the monthly $20 subscription. And then whenever I need new equipment, Ben has been very receptive and thanks. So thank you to the division. And of course, for lending their time. Whenever I have questions about episodes or ideas, I bother everyone and they all let me. Dr. Smuziak, the research partner, all the guests who have been on the show, especially if you've been given the title of friend of the podcast, so thank you very much. And I always end each podcast thanking Dr. Megan Keene-Tarchichi, who helps me with everything. So I'll end this with that as well and say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. I don't have the chat up.
Thanks, Tony, that was fantastic.
Thanks.
I had a question. Has anyone ever explored using, when you commented on how the students felt a community and talked about the podcast and probably got more learning from talking about the podcast, has there ever been like a book club, but podcast club where people got together and talked about it afterwards? Have you heard of that?
I have not. I have been invited to book clubs where they're talking about a topic they use the podcast for. So I'm going to be virtually at, I believe, Austin, Texas, where they're talking about leadership. We did a whole leadership series, but I have not heard of that. No.
Okay.
For some reason, okay. Oh, there we go. All right. Any other, I went right up to where I thought I was going to do, 1252. Great. I didn't see the chat.
Let me look in the chat. We have Sonica says, nicely done, Tony. Thank you for teaching us. You're very good at this. Loretta, this was fabulous, Tony.
Also, go
Tony,
ahead, sorry. Yes, Loretta.
So this was like so fabulous. I'm not a podcast person, but everybody in my family is. So this was really super interesting. And but so first of all, you sound just like Chef John. So what I do listen to are cooking things, and there's a guy, Chef John, who I love, and you sound just like him. And so the question is, so you're so engaging. I'm sure your podcasts are funny and all these things. What if you're just a regular person like myself? I think, how good could I do this? And I actually have to do one in April, and I'm a little nervous, which is part of the reason I was looking at this. So maybe I can get some time with you over coffee.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, Loretta, being a guest is different than being a host. To train to being a host, I really had to learn active listening. It was very, very hard for me. I'm not good at it. And I actually watched excellent hosts. There was a show Inside the Actor Studio with the host recently died. I forget his name, but he was a fantastic host. He knew everything about the guests. He would respond appropriately. He was able to pay attention. He could change topics. I watched Oprah. Honestly, Oprah was excellent at it. Barbara Walters episodes where she would interview people. I watched Graham Norton. I think it's Graham Norton. He has a YouTube where he does podcast interviews. And so being a host, you have to be very good at active listening. And there was a book from the star of MASH, the old TV show, Alan Alda. Alan Alda wrote a book. If you looked at my face, you know I wasn't happy or something like that, where he talks about active listening from a comedy perspective, which is extremely helpful and important in improv. But to be a guest, typically they'll walk you through it. We walk our guests through it. So they'll tell you what they're going to ask you. They may send you questions beforehand, or at least the topic you're going to discuss. So it should be easier if you're a guest. You can always, I ask our guests if they want a copy of all the questions beforehand to look things up. Some do, some don't. So ask wherever you're going. What podcast you're going on?
This is here at Children's. I'm not sure what it's
Oh,
called.
that's pediatrics?
I guess I'm supposed to talk about adolescent medicine. That's all I know thus far.
It's those are, well, Dr. Allie Williams is one of the hosts, so maybe she can help you with that. But yeah, feel free to email me or anything, but they should be able to walk you through it. But that's a great question. To answer John's, go ahead, sorry.
The host of that pediatrics are just going to ask you about your practice. They're going to ask you about what adolescent medicine has to offer. And it's really just to learn more about the resources. If you want, you can email the hosts for your session. It's not me, which makes me sad. I would have loved to interview you.
Maybe you can switch with somebody. That would be great.
I know that would be so much fun, but you could, it should be Arvind Srinath and Dr. Pahalik. They should be the ones to interview you.
All right. Well, Arvind will be great because he took care of my son, so we could joke about that.
Perfect.
And answer John's question, Cribsiders is different from Curbsiders, but it's the same group. Okay, sorry, someone's going to ask a question.
Oh, Kishore had a question. Any data on podcast impacts for parent-oriented medical podcasts?
Kishore, I honestly thought of you and I looked, and I have not seen any data because it would be nice to prove what you're doing is helping patients' families. Kishore does a podcast on Down syndrome where he answers patients' families' questions before they ask it. And so it really helps. And he gets downloads from all over the world from people with kids with Down syndrome. So I think it's very helpful, but I haven't seen any data. But if I see it, I will send it your way.
I have a question regarding our trainees in terms of podcast, and maybe Ellie can comment if she's still on. Do we know how often our trainees are really using this currently?
For PHM from Pittsburgh, we only have 2 fellows, so not a lot, but the residents use it. The residents have commented to me they like the podcast. They listen to it. They will comment on specific episodes. It depends on the resident, but I have gotten numerous comments from residents that they listen to the podcast and like it. I try not to plug it because it's a little self-serving when I'm on, but like if we have a patient with it, and I talked about the exact same diagnosis not long ago on the show with an expert, I will send them all to it. But no, they use it. I don't know at what like the incidence. I have no idea, or the prevalence. Thanks, John.
I just wonder, and I wonder what I'm laughing at John's comment, but I think we should plug these more and market them more. I just wonder if everyone's aware of your podcast and the Allie's podcast, and I don't know. Is there enough awareness?
Yeah, I don't do any. So most people, when they advertise a podcast, will do it on social media. That's where most that podcast advertising is. I don't do any social media at all. I won't go to Twitter or Facebook. It's been Ellie's been trying to get me to change over, and I will not. But all of mine is word of mouth. The hospital hasn't really advertised it very much. For a while, they advertised Kishore's, and they advertised that's pediatrics. But they haven't advertised it much. In my field is so small, everyone knows it. And my division definitely knows it because I bring it up enough. And here I'm being asked to talk about it, which is why I think they're all leaving.
Well, maybe we could talk offline about ways to maybe somehow link that, or in some of the advertising that we're doing. I think that would be great. Is it,
Thank
yeah,
you.
that's a good question from Loretta. Is it on the PEAC's website?
I don't think so.
Maybe we could, Colleen, figure out a home for it on the education page.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
That'd be great. I'd love to have that.
yeah. And John says, makes sense. Social media would be the way to go since many users are younger.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we could, Colleen, loop Brendan into helping, because he's in charge of tweeting out Department of Peds things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe when we talk about where it's going to live on the Peds page, I think we should. All right, well,
Okay.
we'll wrap up we're at the end of the hour. Tony, thank you. This was super. And really, I learned a lot and I'm excited about podcasting. So thank you for that.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
All right, have a great day. Thanks, Colleen.